Today I want to share with you how to make war cake. It's also commonly referred to as the poor man's boiled raisin cake. It became popular during World War I, prevailed in popularity through the Great Depression, and was also popular during World War II, and is still popular today because it's so easy to make and it's very tasty. Plus, it requires no eggs and no butter. Hi sweet friends, I'm Mary and welcome to Mary's Nest, where I teach traditional cooking skills for making nourishing foods like bone broth, ferment, sourdough, and more. So if you enjoy learning how to be a modern pioneer in the kitchen, consider subscribing to my channel and don't forget to click on the little notification bell below. That'll let you know every time I upload a new video. Now the first thing I want to mention is if at any time you want to jump ahead in this video, I will be sure to have the chapter timestamps listed in the description underneath the video as well as in the pinned comment. And I'll also have a link in both the description and the pinned comment to the printable recipe. War cake or boiled raisin cake became very popular during World War I. And this recipe, like many other recipes of that time, used ingredients that were readily available to the home cook when other ingredients were rationed. Now, why were certain ingredients rationed? The reason is those ingredients like flour and sugar, they were used to feed the troops as well as to feed people in countries that were badly affected by World War I. So governments started creating little pamphlets or booklets or small cookbooks that helped home cooks learn how to bake with these new ingredients that they were going to be using, since the other ingredients that they were used to using were often rationed and in some cases just simply unavailable. And one of these recipes was war cake, and that's what it was called, war cake. Now what's special about this cake is that it introduced home cooks to baking with alternate flours as opposed to all-purpose flour. And there were many recipes like this that began to be developed that encouraged home cooks to use alternate flours such as rye flour or cornmeal, buckwheat, oats, so on and so forth. Now, did they have access to some all-purpose flour or white flour or plain flour as you may know it? Yes, but it may have had high points associated with being able to purchase it, or the quantities available were very small. And so any white flour that a home cook was able to get was really stretched and made the most out of. Now these terms of rationing and points and so on and so forth might be unfamiliar to you, but what happened during World War I and World War II was that home cooks were often given booklets with like coupons in them, but not coupons where you're getting a discount on food like we think of them as today, but little coupons that allowed them to trade those in for different products at their grocery store. And the different products had different points associated with them. And those products or foods that were very much in demand for the troops and the allies living in different countries had high points. And those that were very readily available, things like molasses and peanut butter, had very low points or often were sometimes not even rationed and were just very readily available. So home cooks had to be very clever. They had to learn to never waste, and they also had to learn to cook and bake with a whole host of ingredients that maybe they weren't used to working with in the past. But I think most of us know, as home cooks, that when times are tough, we know how to roll up our sleeves and become very clever and really stretch our grocery budgets to get the most out of what we do have available to us. Now I want to share something with you that I think is very interesting, and this is something that came up in a discussion on my community page on YouTube. And if you're not familiar with the community page, if you go to my home page on YouTube, Mary's Nest, there's a toolbar at the top and it lists things like videos, playlists, so on and so forth. And one of the little buttons, so to speak, that you can click on says Community. And in there, I post different things and you can comment. And we were recently having a discussion in there about Depression-era recipes and World War II recipes and so on and so forth. Now, I just want to say, if you want to jump ahead, don't forget, I did put in the timestamps below, but I think what I'm going to share with you is very interesting. A couple of you shared with me that you really questioned the validity of doing or value of recreating recipes from World War I, World War II, the Depression, so on and so forth, because what was available to home cooks then and what may have been affordable to home cooks then is different than what may be available or affordable to us in this year. And that's definitely a very valid point. However, I think what we've learned, especially after going through 2020, is that sometimes what we can experience shortages in is actually quite similar to what home cooks experienced in years previous. And even after 2020, we found that, yes, there can be shortages or there can be very high prices. We recently experienced that with eggs, where the price of eggs went through the roof or often were simply unavailable, and we needed to learn how to bake without eggs. And during 2020, many were scrambling to figure out how to bake with alternate flours, alternate grains, when you could barely find any all-purpose or bread flour on the shelves. And we were also scrambling and trying to figure out how to bake without packaged yeast. And sourdough started to become very popular. So you never know what we're going to experience. And so my opinion is, my humble opinion, is that we should really be prepared for anything. We should know how to cook with eggs, of course, and we should know how to cook without eggs. We should know how to bake with all-purpose flour and make our sourdough starter and also make yeast risen breads, but we should also know how to bake and cook with alternate grains. All of this simply helps our repertoire in the kitchen, in a traditional foods kitchen, and it helps us to become better home cooks and better prepared for whatever life or the economy throws our way. Now, I know right now, bacon is expensive. My husband and I rarely buy it anymore. But when it was more affordable, I would always save my bacon grease, not unlike home cooks of World War I, the Depression, and World War II. And that's what I'm going to be using today. However, if you don't have any bacon grease, use what fat you do have and what fat is affordable wherever you live. If butter is expensive, but you can find some lard in a jar, you can certainly use that. You can also use beef drippings in this recipe, or you can use tallow where you've actually rendered the fat and you have that nice jar or can of tallow. That's the beef fat, and you can definitely use that. My paternal grandmother rarely had bacon, but occasionally she would be able to buy a little pork roast, and she was feeding a family of 8, and this is during the Depression. But she would get that pork roast with the bone in, and then she would remove the bone and stuff what my father often referred to as the pocket, and he loved the stuffing, and it was just bread that would absorb the flavor of the pork. And then she'd save that bone to use to make some sort of soup, and then the pork roast would come with a layer of fat and then the skin on top, the back fat of the pig. When she would roast that pork, the fat would render down into the pan and the skin would become very crisp. And my dad tells me that she loved that crisp skin, cracklings as we think of it. And it is very tasty. I certainly enjoy it too. But she now had some lard, what had been rendered, the fat that had been rendered underneath that skin on that pork roast. So if you're making a roast and you're blessed to get one that has a pork roast and it has that fat and the skin, be sure to save those drippings. If you're making a beef roast and it's a rather fatty cut like a chuck or something like that, be sure to save all the fat that melts off of that. All of these forms of fat can be used in various types of cooking. Now, specifically, you may have heard terms like leaf lard and tallow, which I used earlier. Those specifically refer to the fat that's around the organ of the animals. And if you are able to find some leaf fat, or actually the proper term for the fat around the cow's organs is suet. And if you are able to find some leaf fat from the pig or suet from the cow, you can render those. And I have videos where I show you how to do this. It's very easy to do. When you render the suet, you have tallow. And that's a little different than the fat from just beef drippings, although people will often use the term tallow for either or. Actual tallow is a little harder, and the renderings from beef fat, just general beef fat, is a little softer. And so the tallow has a little longer shelf life than just the beef drippings. But regardless, all of this is wonderful to have and collect in our traditional foods kitchen and use in baking or use in cooking. Tallow and beef drippings are wonderful for deep frying because they have a very high smoke point. And if the term smoke point is new to you, what that means is the temperature to which you can heat the fat before it starts to smoke. And smoke indicates it's burning, and you don't want to go above the smoke point. But the nice thing about tallow and beef fat, the beef fat drippings, is that it has a very high smoke point, which makes it wonderful for deep frying. Now, you might be concerned and say, oh my goodness, but the back fat from the pig or the bacon grease or the beef drippings, they're going to have a flavor to them, and that flavor is going to be imparted into my baked goods. You may be okay using it to saute up things. Who doesn't love potatoes sauteed in bacon grease or something like that? But you might say, well, I don't know about it for baking, and that's a great point. But you know what home cooks in previous generations knew to do? They knew, which we'll talk about in a minute, to add a lot of spices. And they added a lot of cinnamon and cloves and nutmeg, allspice, whatever they had, and they would add that into their cakes. And that's why you'll often notice that cakes from those eras in time will appear darker. And it's simply because a lot of spices were added in to cover up any flavors of bacon or pork or beef. But no one knew. They found these cakes delicious. And that's what's so fascinating about war cake, because it has prevailed well into now our generation because it's so darn tasty. People love it and are still making it. Now, if you look at different recipes for war cake, you can actually track its transition over the different decades as different flours, different sweeteners, so on and so forth, were readily available and affordable. And you may find war cake recipes that are using white flour, all-purpose or plain flour, and white sugar. So that's certainly an option. But something that I love about the original recipes, which is what we're going to make today, the original recipes from World War I and the Depression, and to a certain extent World War II, was that when people had to ration these types of things like white flour and white sugar in their kitchens, they actually wound up making their foods, their baked goods, more nutritious. Because what were they using? They were relying on whole grain flours, and they were relying on liquid sweeteners like molasses or sorghum or honey. And these are all more nutritious than white flour, or than white sugar. And the whole grains obviously are more nutritious than the white flour. But this is such a boon, so to speak, to the traditional foods kitchen, to the modern day traditional foods kitchen, to those of us who are modern pioneers in the kitchen. We want to bring back using traditional foods and making the foods we bake or cook more nutritious, more nutrient dense, more nutrient rich. And that's what we can do by learning how to make these very traditional recipes. They can help us during difficult times when maybe certain ingredients aren't available or other ingredients are very expensive, but they can also just help us develop our traditional cooking skills. So thank you for indulging me as I shared all of this information with you, and now we'll get to making war cake. Now I just want to share with you that the recipe we're going to be using today is a traditional recipe. It actually comes from a pamphlet called Victory Recipes of the Great War. And I'll be sure to put a link to this download in the description or in the pinned comment underneath this video. It's very interesting. It's part of a special that was done by our public broadcasting system here in the United States, all about this era. And they have a number of downloads. And of course, being a home cook, this one interested me the most. But what they go through is they give the home cook different ideas. They have wheatless Monday, meatless Tuesday, wheatless Wednesday, and sugar-saving, fat-saving Thursday, and fat-free Friday, porkless Saturday. I'm making a mock sausage, which I think is very interesting, and then sugarless Sunday. And that's the recipe that we're going to be following for sugarless Sunday. And as you see, it was called war cake. Now, just because they say sugarless doesn't mean that the cake isn't sweet. We're going to be using alternate sweeteners. The government wanted to encourage people not to use white sugar, or to give home cooks an option if they didn't even have any white sugar. So here are the ingredients. You're going to need, this is where I do make a little variation. So for what I'm making here, you'll want to check with the printable recipe that I'll have over on my website, along with a corresponding blog post, where I'll share a lot more information about recipes of these different eras. But it calls for 1 cup molasses, 1 cup corn syrup. Now this is where I'm changing things up a little. I'm not going to use corn syrup. I'm just going to use more molasses, and I'll explain why in a minute. First of all, what I'll say is that corn syrup today is something that's highly, I'm not sure what the process was during World War I. If you know, be sure to share it in the comments below. But today, corn syrup is a highly processed ingredient. And even we're not even talking about high fructose corn syrup, just plain corn syrup. And it often may come from GMO corn, which I know many of you have shared with me, you prefer not to have in your traditional foods kitchen, and I understand that completely. So we're going to skip over that. And then you're also going to need 1.5 cups water, 1 package of raisins. And a package of raisins back at this time was probably somewhere around 2 cups. And that would be relatively equivalent to what you would get in a box of raisins, not the little boxes, but the regular size box of raisins today, a little more than 2 cups. Then I'm actually going to use a little more fat, and I'll explain why in a minute about that as well. This cake was really limiting the amount of fat that they put in. And that was a good thing because often, as I shared in the previous video that I did for you about peanut butter bread, fat was very prized during both World War I and World War II. Home cooks often didn't have a lot, and they would often, after using what they could, and straining out the little bits and bobs that might be in it, they would give it to their local butcher, who would return the tin can to them and then give them a little money for that. And that was often seen as both patriotic and also of a value to them, because that fat was then given to the military, which they used for various important purposes. So this is really limiting the fat as well. So you can, if you want, just go with the 2 tablespoons of fat, whatever fat you might want to use. I'm going to be using bacon grease. I have a lot of it, and so I want to use it up. So I'm actually going to be using a 1/2 cup of bacon fat. And the reason is later recipes do call for more fat. And from what I've researched, it says that it does make a little tastier, a little moister cake that has a little bit of a longer shelf life. But if you want to pull back on the fat, you still can, and it'll come out fine. So that's 2 tablespoons. I'm using half a cup. And you're also going to need a little extra fat because you're going to have to grease the pan. And we'll talk about the pan in a little bit. You're going to need then a teaspoon of salt, a teaspoon of cinnamon, a half a teaspoon of cloves, a half a teaspoon of nutmeg, and then you're going to need 3 cups of rye flour. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that in detail. And then you're going to need a half a teaspoon of baking soda and 2 teaspoons of baking powder. And jumping back to the rye flour, if you want, the recipe does call for allowing you to substitute some rolled oats in place of the rye flour. Now, why rye flour? Rye flour was more available to home cooks during World War I because the wheat flour was usually used to make bread products and whatnot for the troops and the Allies living in countries that were heavily affected by war. So this is one of those examples where we're going to be using an alternate flour that was more available to the home cook at that time. Can you use a white flour, a plain flour, an all-purpose flour? Yes. But I recommend that you do use a whole grain flour, even if you just use whole wheat flour, which is very easy to find at the grocery store, so that you become accustomed to baking a quick bread. That's what this is, a quick bread. We're not using yeast or sourdough. We're going to be using baking powder and baking soda. That you become accustomed to baking with whole grains and you get a feel for what a whole grain quick bread looks like and tastes like. Now, I just want to go back to a minute, as I promised you, to talk about why I'm actually going to wind up using 2 cups of molasses as opposed to 1 cup of molasses and 1 cup of corn syrup. My mother grew up with this cake, and my mother has made this cake, as did my grandmother. And my maternal grandmother used molasses exclusively for her sweetener. And when she made war cake, she made it with just molasses. So I'm going to do the same thing. And I know from my mom, she tells me it was still very tasty. They've never missed the corn syrup. They never had corn syrup available to them. But other alternatives you could use could be honey or sorghum, if you have that, or date syrup. And if you want to just get very modern, of course, if you have a traditional foods kitchen where you use coconut syrup, you can certainly use that as well. But the importance of using a liquid sweetener is to become accustomed to baking quick breads with liquid sweeteners. Now, I think most of us on our traditional foods journey really try to, over time, limit how much white sugar that we have in our kitchens. So we're getting accustomed to using different types of liquid sweeteners, and that's a good thing. But if you're very new and at the beginning of your traditional foods journey, this is an important skill to learn, because baking with liquid sweeteners can be a little different than baking with dry sweeteners. Even if you bake with things like sucanat, which is the dried sugarcane juice. And even today, sucanat, or you may also know it as rapadura, depending on where you live in the world, both of them have become relatively expensive. So learning how to move away from both white sugar as well as the unprocessed version of sugar, the sucanat or the rapadura, can be helpful and can be thrifty to our traditional foods kitchens. Now, can you mix liquid sweeteners? By all means. You can use molasses and honey, molasses and sorghum. You can use just honey or just sorghum. So you do have options available to you. Don't feel you need to just use one liquid sweetener. But for this recipe, you are going to need 2 cups of whatever liquid sweetener you decide to use. Now this recipe is already adjusted for us based on how much liquid is being used in this recipe, as well as liquid sweetener. But the general rule is whenever you want to replace white sugar or some other form of dried sweetener with a liquid sweetener, you're going to either have to reduce any other liquid in the recipe, or if there's not any other liquid, you're going to have to increase the flour. And it really varies. Sometimes you have to experiment a little. Sometimes you may be adding about an additional 1/4 cup of flour or reducing a 1/4 cup of liquid. As I said, the recipe calls for 3 cups of flour. However, it does allow you to substitute 1 cup with rolled oats, and that's what I'm going to do. Now, when it comes to using rye flour, you have a couple of options depending where you are on the continuum, so to speak, of your traditional foods journey. You can certainly buy rye flour at your local grocery store or at a specialty store, or you can order it online. With the advent of a growing interest in creating traditional foods kitchens and cooking traditional foods and baking traditional foods, we have found that a lot of alternate grains are becoming more and more accessible to us as home cooks, and one of those is rye flour. You may also be starting to see at your local grocery store or a local specialty store, and of course online, spelt flour, which is an ancient grain, and also even einkorn flour, which is another ancient grain. But of all three, probably locating rye flour is going to be the easiest. And in a pinch, if you can't find rye flour, you can make this with whole wheat flour, which is always, I shouldn't always say always, but for the most part is readily accessible at most grocery stores. 2020 was a different story, and that's why we're learning how to bake with all different types of ingredients, because we never know what might be available and what might not be available at our local grocery store. And if you decide you want to make this cake with whole wheat flour, you can still substitute the 1 cup of whole wheat flour with the rolled oats. And we're going to be using old-fashioned rolled oats, not instant oats. Now, depending, as I mentioned earlier, where you are on the continuum of your traditional foods journey, you may have a grain mill. And you may be storing whole grain, and you may have whole rye grain, or rye berries, or rye groats, as they're also known. I really like to store whole grain. And if you're interested in learning more about that, I have a number of videos where I go over different ways to grind grain and different ways to store grain and so on and so forth. And I'll be sure to put links to those videos. And I put them all together in a playlist for you to make it very easy. And so I'll be sure to link to that playlist below. But what I've got over here are rye berries or rye groats. And I like to store whole grain like this, and then I like to mill it fresh. And the reason I like to store whole grain, as I explain in these other videos that I mentioned earlier, is because whole grain has a very long shelf life. Once you grind whole grain into flour, it has a much shorter shelf life because you're including the bran and the germ, and these things have oils in them, and it's these oils that can cause the flour to go rancid quicker than when everything is intact in the actual whole grain, in the actual whole grain. Because once you grind this grain, I personally, again, my humble opinion, I think that it can stay fresh, stored in a cool, dry place and stored properly for about 6 months. Some people will say a year. Some people like to put it in their freezer. I have mixed emotions about that because sometimes putting grains in the refrigerator, or flours, I should say, in the refrigerator or the freezer can affect their moisture content. And so I really like to just store them properly in a cool, dry place, or store the flour in a cool, dry place. But generally, I will keep my grain whole until I'm ready to use it. Now, one thing I want to mention about grinding whole grain into whole grain flour, and this is something I've received many questions on, is it different baking with fresh milled flour than it is with flour you would buy at the grocery store? And yes, there are differences when you bake with fresh milled flours. But the answer is, there is no simple answer to this. Let me explain. When you grind whole grain into freshly milled flour, a lot depends on what whole grain you're grinding into flour to then use to bake. Are you using hard red wheat? Are you using hard white wheat? Are you using soft wheat? Are you using rye, einkorn, spelt, so on and so forth? The type of whole grain that you're grinding into freshly milled flour will determine how much water you'll need or not need when baking with that freshly milled flour. There is a general rule, but often this general rule just applies to the assumption that the home baker or home cook is grinding hard red wheat berries. So the general rule, so to speak, although general, doesn't really apply to every single type of freshly milled flour. For example, if you grind whole grain or the whole grain of a red wheat berry, a hard red wheat berry, that's going to be thirstier than the whole wheat flour you buy at the grocery store. And so you're going to need to adjust the liquid in your recipe, maybe by about 1/4 cup, meaning that you'll need 1/4 cup more liquid if you use the same amount of flour called for in the recipe. You could always keep the liquid the same and decrease your freshly milled flour by about 1/4 cup. And I really want to stress the fact that I'm saying about for a very specific reason. So much of this depends on the conditions in your kitchen that are affected by the conditions of the weather outside of your kitchen, which are affected by wherever you may live in the world. So there is a certain level of experimentation that you will have to engage in, so to speak, when you start baking with freshly milled flours. For example, we gave the example just a few minutes ago about baking with hard red wheat that had been ground from the hard red wheat berry and how you might need more liquid. Interestingly enough, if you use soft white wheat berries, which make a nice sort of pastry flour type flour, you're probably going to need a little less water. And if you find that you're baking with einkorn that you've milled or spelt that you've milled, yes, they may all be a little thirstier than if you buy the than if you buy the flour from the store that's already been ground and sitting on the shelf for a while, but it may not be that much thirstier because ancient grains and soft wheats often require less water than the more hard wheats. So I know this can become very confusing and very overwhelming at times, but it all comes down to the fact that the moisture content of some grains is simply higher than the moisture content in other grains. And as I said, you have to be willing to have a little trial and error in your kitchen, whether you're using these grains that you've freshly milled to make quick breads, or you're using these grains to make a sourdough bread or a yeasted bread. And if you practice and through trial and error, you're going to start to be comfortable with seeing how your dough is and then seeing how it bakes up. So if you are baking with an ancient grain and you find that, maybe this is a little overly dense or a little overly moist, you'll know next time to pull back on the water. Or if you're baking with a different type of grain, a modern grain, a hard red wheat, and you say, this is a little dry. I think maybe I could have used a little more liquid. Even maybe when you're working with the dough, it may seem a little dry to you. You'll know next time to add a little more liquid. So it's really going to be the whole process of trial and error. But trust me, it's only going to take you 1 or 2, at the most maybe 3 times of baking with freshly milled flours to start to get a feel for how much liquid, how much extra liquid, or how much less liquid you need. Now today, I'm going to use my mock mill, and if you've been with me for a while, you know that I love my electric mock mill. Yes, I have a manual grain mill, which I share with you in a previous video, but when I was able to buy an electric grain mill, I did a lot of research, and I was so happy to decide on this mock mill. And I do have the Mock Mill 100. It's the smaller one. It's perfect for my size family. And I researched so much before I bought an electric grain mill. And I love this grain mill so much. It's a stone grinding grain mill. And this housing, it's not wood, but it's made from all recycled materials. And that's what helps keep the cost down. This is a very affordable grain mill. And I like this grain mill so much that I contacted Mock Mill and I asked them, could you give my viewers a discount? Because I paid for this myself. I was not given this Mock Mill. And I asked them, would you provide a discount code for my viewers if they decided that they ever wanted to buy a mock mill? And so they were very kind to offer a discount. And so I'll be sure to put that link to not just the discount for that, but to my shopping guide over on my webpage, where you'll find the discount coupon code for Mock Mill. But I have a whole bunch of discount coupon codes for you, so be sure to check out my shopping guide. It's a nice way to save money. But in any event, I love this thing. It works like a gem. And if you are grinding whole grain, you might wonder, well, how much flour am I going to get from this? And 1 cup, again, this is just like the way I was talking about baking with freshly milled grains and using you may and about and a lot of words like that. It's the same when it comes to grinding whole grain. A lot can depend on what type of grain you're grinding. The general rule, again, is that about a cup of whole grain will yield you about a cup and a half of flour. But again, that's just a very general rule, and often, as I mentioned earlier, these general rules are based on hard red wheat berries. So depending on what you're grinding, it may come out slightly differently. I have found that depending on what grain I'm grinding, I can get anywhere from a cup and a quarter to a cup and a half of flour. Now I'm going to grind a couple of cups while I have my mock mill out, and any flour that I have left over, I'll just use over the next few days, so I'm not too concerned about having extra flour. But I also want to mention, as I shared with you earlier, when you bake with freshly milled grain, yes, there are sometimes you have to make adjustments. I don't want to fool around with the liquid measurements in this recipe, so what I'm going to be doing is adding just a little bit more flour, about 1/8 of a cup, in addition to the oats. So instead of the total of 3 cups, I'll be using about 3 1/8 cups. So I'll have 2 cups and 1/8 of the rye flour, and I'll have 1 cup of the oats. And the reason is I have learned from experience that when I use or bake with freshly milled rye flour, I find it having about that extra 1/8 of a cup helps to create the final product the way I want it to be. Alrighty, so I'm just going to put 2 cups of flour, 2 cups of rye groats or rye berries in my mock mill. And then over here you'll see there are settings from 1 to 10. I like generally to grind my grain on number 5. And the reason is I like a little bit of a coarseness to my flour, because I will show you often. I'm not going to do it today because I'm going to just use the whole grain flour as is, 100% whole grain, since that's what the recipe calls for. But I'll show you what I normally do. These are flour sifters, and I'll put a link in the description underneath this video. Places like Breadtopia sell these, King Arthur sells them. You can also find them on Amazon, but they usually come in, might be like number 40, number 50, number 60, and what those numbers refer to is how tight or how loose the mesh is in the bottom of these, which will determine how much bran and germ you can sift out of your flour. And that is why I like to grind my grain on setting number 5. It's a little coarse and it makes it a little easier to sift out the bran and the germ. Now, do I sift out so much that I get sort of a homemade version of all-purpose flour? Generally no, but you can do that, and I have a video where I show you how to do that. And I do occasionally make my own sort of all-purpose blend, which works very nicely when making sourdough breads, because it's not as all-purpose, so to speak, as what you would buy at the grocery store. It's more like a country-style flour, I might almost call it that, that still has a little bit of the bran and the germ in it, but for the most part, you've lightened it up considerably. However, what I usually do when I'm making something that I want to be primarily a whole grain flour, I will sift out about, and it's an estimate, about a quarter of the bran and the germ. And I usually just use a number 40. I find that easy, and I'll just sift it out over my bowl until I feel I look like, okay, to me, and as I said, I have videos where I go into this in great detail, and I'll be sure to link to those. But I do find that sifting out a little bit of the bran and the germ, now you're leaving 3/4 of it behind, so you're getting all that good nutrition. But I find sifting out about a quarter of the bran and the germ to just generally make a lighter baked good, a lighter quick bread, as well as lighter yeasted breads, as well as lighter sourdough breads. And I never feel bad about doing this because this is something that our ancestors did. They were doing this back in the Middle Ages, where they were sifting out a little bit of the bran and the germ because they knew it would make a lighter loaf of bread and one that was more digestible. So never feel bad about sifting out a little bit of the bran and the germ. Today, though, we're just going to go all in with 100% whole grain, since that's what the recipe calls for. Alrighty, here we go. Well, this is just beautifully ground rye flour. And I know some of you have asked me this, does the flour get very hot? And no, it doesn't get hot, it just feels mildly warm. But it is stone ground, so there is as much protection as possible for the naturally occurring oils in the whole grain. And the reason that we don't want the whole grain to get too hot as it's being milled into flour is because the heat can cause those oils that are naturally occurring in the whole grain to become rancid. And if you don't, I want to share a little tip with you. I think you'll find this interesting. If you don't have a grain mill like this, an electric grain mill, certainly if you've got a manual grain mill, you can grind grain or mill grain. However, if you have one of those high-speed blenders like a Vitamix, or I think there are a lot of brands out there now, and you have an approved container for grinding grain in, and so you use that to grind your grain. My girlfriend, she makes so much bread. She has about eight children, and so she is quite the home cook. And what she shared with me this tip, and I thought that it was wonderful, and I want to share it with you, that she puts her whole grain into the freezer and then grinds it in her, I believe she has a Vitamix, grinds it in her grain grinding container or whatever that Vitamix sells. And she finds that when she's done with the process, and she does it in small batches, that the grain is warm, not hot. So I thought that was a good tip. Now we'll measure out about how much flour that we did get from this process. I'm just using this little scoop to get the last bits out of my bowl, but it looks like I got almost 3 cups. I got a little bit left in there, which I'll go ahead and dump in, but I put the 1 cup in there, and then I put a 2nd cup of flour in there, and now I'm going to put in almost this 3rd cup. So I think I got about 3 cups, and I've got that little bit left in there. So 2 cups of grain gave me, of the whole grain, gave me approximately 3 cups of freshly milled flour. And that's using rye berries or rye groats. And I don't mean to confuse you by saying rye berries or rye groats. It means exactly the same thing. It's just rye groats is more of an old-fashioned term and was often what whole rye was referred to as. And today you often hear it being referred to as rye berries. You still hear whole oats being referred to as oat groats and not oat berries. At least I've not heard that. But I want you to know they do mean the same thing. Now what I've got in this bowl is 2 1/8 cups of my whole grain rye flour. Now, if you're using whole grain rye flour from the grocery store, you're probably just going to need 2 cups. I've got that little extra 1/8 cup in there because, as I shared with you, I've learned from grinding it fresh, I need that little bit of extra flour. As I shared earlier, every whole grain reacts differently when milled into fresh milled flour and then used for baking. I have simply learned from experience, trial and error, that with the amount of liquid in this recipe, I was going to need a little more than just the 2 cups of rye flour, and that's why I added in that extra 1/8 cup. However, if you're using whole grain rye flour for this recipe from the grocery store, you probably don't need to add any extra rye flour. And if you're substituting whole wheat flour that you've purchased at the grocery store, you can probably just leave it as is, leave the recipe as is. But again, it's all about trial and error. If you find the cake is a little over moist, you'll know how to adjust things next time. If it's a little dry, you'll know how to adjust things for the next time. But don't worry, the bottom line is with so much of this, the difference isn't that significant. And often, as I've shared with you, when it comes to baking bread, the same is true with baking cake. People are just happy you made cake. And if it's a little dry or a little moist, they're not going to really notice. Everybody's just going to be happy to have cake. Now let's talk about the pan that we're going to use to bake this cake. The original recipe calls for using 2 loaf pans. There's no specialization as to what size of loaf pan. Loaf pans generally are about 9 inches by 5 inches, sometimes 8 inches by 4.5 inches. There are some variations, but as I said in this recipe, there's no specification, and I'm not really sure what size a loaf pan was during World War I. But you can go ahead and bake this in 2 loaf pans. You're going to get 2 loaf cakes. Now, you might say, wow, that's a lot, but you have to keep in mind these recipes were geared to homemakers who were often feeding large families. Both of my grandmothers were feeding 8. Alternatively, and this is a tip from my mom. My mom is 98, so I always like to say she's got a few good tips to share. She always made this type of cake in a tube pan. Now, can you use a bundt pan? Sure. They were not, what they invented sometime, was it 1950 or a little time after? You have to let me know in the comments below. But my mother and my grandmother never had bundt pans. And my mother always, boy, as long as I can remember, made pretty much every kind of cake she made in a tube pan. And as a matter of fact, this is her tube pan. and it is specifically made for making angel food cake. But she made pretty much every cake in this, which I think is very cute. But she had a good reason. My mother, as I've shared with you, was a big fan of Adele Davis. And even though my mother was very refined and sophisticated, she would be described in terms of her kitchen and her thought pattern by today's standards being like a crunchy granola mama, which you often hear. My mother was very concerned about good nutrition. And so she baked with whole grains whenever she could get whole grain flour. And she found that whole grain flour definitely baked differently than all-purpose or bread flour, which is simply just a little higher in protein, made for making bread, but does have all the bran and the germs sifted out of it. So she found that often when baking these sort of denser, heavier whole grain cakes in loaf pans, that they wouldn't quite bake through in the middle. And she would wind up having to tent it so that it wouldn't overbrown and sort of overbake it in terms of the exterior to get the middle baked thoroughly and not be damp or moist. And if you're a whole grain baker, you probably know exactly what I'm talking about. But she found that using her angel food cake pan, and these have been around, I think these were invented in the late 1800s, and she found that baking all of her whole grain cakes in a tube pan allowed the cake to bake up beautifully, and you didn't have to worry about the center. That with the tube pan, there was no concern about the center being overly dense or more overly moist, whatever the case may be, because there was no center. You had the tube there. And so she loved baking everything in this pan. I have this pan, which is similar. It's also, like a tube pan. It's kind of, in many ways, kind of like, I can't really quite call it a bundt pan because it's not fancy, but it's just sort of a very basic, generic looking tube pan. And the only difference is this one actually has the release like this because it was made for making angel food cake. And if you've ever made angel food cake, I know this is something my mother would always do to make it easier to release. She would turn it upside down, and she'd maybe have some kind of bottle or something, and she would stick this on the bottle, and then as the cake cooled, it was a little easier to release. So that's kind of interesting. But I think today, since I realize not everyone might have an angel food cake pan like this, I'm going to go ahead. I think most folks will have a simple tube pan like this, or a bundt pan you can certainly use, but we're going to talk about greasing these in a minute. If you use a bundt pan, because it has all those little crevices, grease it really, really well. And of course, if you've got the loaf pans, by all means you can use these. We are baking this cake in a little bit of a slower oven. It's very cute. The original recipe from World War I doesn't even really give a temperature. It just says moderate oven. And when I talk with my mom, it's cute because she says, oh yeah, people would just say a slow oven, a moderate oven, and women home cooks just knew what that meant. But so what we're going to do is, since this, just from my own personal experience, I've found that your whole grain, denser cakes do tend to do better when baked in a more moderate oven than a high oven. Even your traditional 350-degree Fahrenheit oven can be a little hot for baking whole grain cakes. What I like to do is pull it down to 325 degrees Fahrenheit. This generally allows the cake to bake through without over browning, and I don't have to worry about tenting it while it finishes, tenting it with aluminum foil on top so it doesn't over brown on top, but allows it sufficient time to continue baking. And I think you're going to find this exceptionally helpful if, when baking this bread or any whole grain quick bread for that matter, if you bake your quick bread in a loaf pan as opposed to a tube pan, and you bake it at 325 degrees Fahrenheit, you're going to have a better chance of not needing to tent it with aluminum foil. You're going to have a better chance of it probably not over browning on top before it's thoroughly cooked in the middle. So the two things we're going to do before we start mixing our batter is, number one, preheat our oven to 325 degrees Fahrenheit, and we're going to go ahead and grease and flour our pan. So what I've got here is some bacon grease, and I have strained out all the little bits and bobs, as I often call them, from my bacon grease. And I like to do that with the bacon grease that I set aside to use for baking. If I'm going to be saving my bacon grease just to saute up some potatoes or vegetables, then I don't worry about it. But for baked goods, I do like to strain out all the little bits and bobs. So I'm going to take some of this bacon grease and I'm going to start greasing my pan. And I'm going to grease this really well. I've got my tube pan all greased up, and now I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle some of my extra rye flour in here and coat this really well, because we don't want anything to stick. Well, I've got my tube pan all greased and dusted with a little bit of that rye flour, that extra rye flour I had. Now I'm going to go ahead and set this aside, and then we're going to prepare our dry ingredients and our wet ingredients and mix our batter. Well, for our dry ingredients, we're going to go ahead and add a half a teaspoon, as the recipe calls, of baking soda and 2 teaspoons of baking powder. And I'll just put these right down in with the flour, and then we'll give everything a good whisk. Now we're just going to go ahead and whisk all of this together to get both the baking soda and the baking powder well distributed with our flour. And you might be wondering, why are you not adding the salt in too, Mary? I think that's a great question. And to be honest with you, I can't give you a 100% correct answer. The recipe requires the salt to be added with the wet ingredients that we're actually going to be cooking on the stove. So I found that interesting. So if you know, maybe from your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother, why the salt was added in with the raisins and the other wet ingredients and cooked like that, I'd love to hear about it. And I want to thank you. Boy, some of the stories that you have shared with me have just been wonderful about your memories of your mom or your grandmother making these various recipes. From most of the time, the stories have been about the Depression or World War II. And it's been so much fun. So whenever you get a chance, leave me those stories in the comments. I really enjoy reading them. And if you've been with me for a while, you know I love my magic whisk. You might be saying, why is she using such a little whisk? I love this thing, and it does a better job than any other whisk I've ever used. And it literally costs only a couple of dollars. So look for it in a local kitchen store or maybe in the kitchen aisle at your grocery store. I'll put a link in the description below, but I think they're readily available. Many years ago, I saw Nigella Lawson using one, and I thought it looked so clever, and she kind of raved about it. And so I said, I need to have a magic whisk. And it really mixes everything beautifully. It's great, like if you're doing like eggs and you're, oh, there's my oven, it just preheated. And liquids, oh gosh, it just works so great. Well, I'm going to set this flour aside, and now we'll get to working on pulling together everything else. I almost forgot my oats. So I've got my 1 cup of old-fashioned rolled oats, and I'm going to go ahead and add those in. Now, of course, you could use all rye flour or all other version of whole grain flour, whatever you've got, but I'm going to add in these oats, especially since the recipe mentioned it as a possible substitution for some of the rye flour. And what's nice is oats were commonly used during wartime baking, whether World War I or World War II, since they were relatively available. So that's something that I want to copy. And I also like to add oats into pretty much any quick breads that I bake. And I've got a couple of oatmeal breads, and it's great. It's such a oatmeal or old-fashioned rolled oats are such a pantry staple, or they should be, and they have a fairly good shelf life, and you can use them to make so many kinds of things, and to also sort of beef up recipes. You can use them in making meatballs and meatloaf, you know, to stretch hamburgers, even to kind of stretch your ground beef. I have a whole video on different types of meal extenders, and oatmeal is one of them. You can never go wrong with oatmeal. Alrighty, well, now we're going to get to this point that I think is so interesting, and how this recipe has not just the name wart cake, but boiled raisin cake, or also sometimes, because it was popular during the Depression, poor man's boiled raisin cake. And so we've got our one package, approximately 2 cups, a little more, of raisins, and we're going to go ahead and put those into a nice saucepan here. Now, to the raisins in our saucepan, we're going to go ahead and add 1.5 cups of water. And to the water and raisins, I'm going to go ahead and add in my molasses. This is 1 cup, and then I'll go ahead and add in my 2nd cup. And I do want to mention the molasses that I'm using is just a simple unsulfured molasses. I'm not using the blackstrap molasses. You certainly could if you wanted, but blackstrap molasses has a much stronger flavor because it's boiled more times than just your plain molasses. So if you're going with 2 cups of molasses, you may want to just use a regular plain and simple unsulfured molasses as opposed to the blackstrap, because the flavor might be too strong. Now we're going to go ahead and add in our fat. This is the bacon grease. You might recall that the actual original recipe for World War I called for only 2 tablespoons, but later recipes did increase the amount of fat, often bacon grease. So I'm going to go with the larger amount. But again, it should be just fine if you decrease it. Now I'm going to go ahead and add in my teaspoon of salt. And now we add in the various spices. I'll talk about the vanilla in a minute. If you notice, that wasn't in the original recipe that I shared with you. But I'll share you a little something that my mother shared with me about the vanilla. But first, let's talk about the spices. What I've got here is allspice. Now, this is not called for in the original recipe. They call for nutmeg. I do have the whole nutmeg here, and we can grate that in. I'm just not a huge fan of nutmeg, so I may not add in any, but I do like allspice. So I've got ground allspice here, and I've also got ground cloves, and then I've got ground cinnamon in here. My mother shared with me that her mom, not so much my mother's case, because the spices were more available by the time my mom was grown and cooking in her own marriage and for her own family. But my grandmother didn't always have every single spice available to her. And what I learned from reading too, and what my mother also shared with me, was that home cooks often, in situations like this where the fat that they were having to use was some sort of animal-based fat as opposed to a dairy-based fat, even though, yes, that's an animal fat, but in terms of the actual from the animal as opposed to the cream from the milk, and then in terms turned into butter. But when they were using some type of animal fat, like a lard or a bacon grease or tallow, often both my grandmothers often made lamb, and it would be, you know, more like mutton than the common lamb chops we may think of today. And both of my grandmothers might have a leg of lamb. My mother shared with me that where they lived, lamb was affordable. And so my maternal grandmother, but I also know from my father, my paternal grandmother as well, would buy a leg of lamb and roast it and use whatever fat drippings came off of it, again, to be used for cooking. And lamb fat, if you've ever smelled it, can have a relatively strong odor if it's coming from mutton, you know, from your older lambs. And so, but my maternal grandmother was often did have more access to more lamb than my paternal grandmother. But my maternal grandmother would use a lot of that mutton fat to bake. And so my mother shared with me that she would use a lot, whatever spices she could get her hands on when she was making a baked good and using that mutton fat. And so there'd be a lot of cinnamon if she had it. Sometimes she didn't always have cinnamon. And so she'd throw in a lot of cloves or a lot of nutmeg or whatever she had, allspice. And my mom said it always wound up tasting great. So you're really welcome to use whatever combination of spices that you like and that you have on hand. You will be acting very much like a home cook of those earlier eras that basically used whatever spices they had. So the first one we'll go ahead, and I'm not going to be too exact about this. If it's a little rounded, I'm not going to worry. I'm going to go ahead and sprinkle in the cinnamon. And this is that Ceylon cinnamon. I don't know if you've been reading a lot about the different types of cinnamon. Ceylon cinnamon is supposed to be exceptionally healthy for us. I'm going to leave out the nutmeg, and then it calls for a half a teaspoon of cloves, and then a half a teaspoon of the nutmeg. I'm going to do a half a teaspoon of allspice. So we'll get our half a teaspoon in there. Cloves can be strong. So if you find that all you have on hand are ground cloves, you may want to go a little easy. You may not want to go too crazy with it. And then let's get about a half a teaspoon of allspice. All the spices smell delicious. I especially like the allspice. The cinnamon is wonderful too, but allspice is really nice. Okay, now let's get this onto the heat. And we're going to bring this up to a boil, and then it says to boil it for 5 minutes. So I'm going to go ahead and put this on its highest setting to get this up to a boil. Some of you have asked me about this cooktop, this little countertop cooktop, and I'll put a link to this in the description below. I do get a lot of questions about this. Yes, I do like it. It does run hot, so you have to be a little careful if you're just using it for general cooking. It comes in very handy for home canning if you're a home canner. I've shared a lot of videos with you on home canning. The fact that it runs a little hot works very well with home canning, but especially water bath, specifically water bath canning is what I'll use it for. But just general cooking, you just have to be a little careful. So I'm going to watch this very closely as it comes up to a boil. And even to keep it at a rolling boil and to keep it from not over boiling, I may actually have to adjust the temperature. But I'm going to have it at the 5 is its highest setting. I'm going to have it at 5 to bring it up to a boil. Something that I find very interesting about this particular cake, as well as some other cakes, as well as some other breads from like quick bread type things from the World War I and World War II and Depression era, all of it, is that sometimes they will say this bread is best if eaten 2 or 3 days after it's baked. And I always find that very intriguing. And I figure they maybe feel that it firms up a little bit because these do tend to be moister cakes and moister breads, especially when they're baked in loaf pans. And so did that allow it to maybe dry out and firm up a little, especially with using the liquid sweeteners? Or did it just allow the flavors to meld, and did they find that it was tastier? I'm not sure what the answer is. If your mom, and my mom didn't know either, but she remembered that, although they weren't always very good about doing that. With a lot of hungry kids, they looked forward to diving into cakes and breads like this very quickly. Well, this came up to a boil, and I'm just going to watch this very carefully and keep stirring it because I got to be careful that this doesn't boil over. I think it'd be a little bit of a sticky mess. And I'm just going to keep stirring this, as I said, for 5 minutes. And when it's done, We're going to let it cool, and then once it's cool, we can finish our batter. Well, my raisin mixture has cooled down to room temperature. I transferred it out of that hot pot and put it in a measuring cup. It's just going to be easier to pour in to my bowl here. And also, that hot pot, that's a cast iron, enameled cast iron pan. It was really holding the heat. So if you're using a cast iron saucepan, you may find transferring it to some sort of other vessel will help it cool a little quicker. Now, let's take a minute to talk about the vanilla. My mom shared with me that if my grandmother had vanilla, she'd always add this into any type of cake she was making, especially those where she was using those various animal fats that might have a aroma or a strong flavor. And she would just put it into the liquid one. She wouldn't boil it with any mixture she was making. She would add it in once it cooled down to room temperature. And my mother always added vanilla into pretty much everything. So I'm just going to go ahead and measure in a teaspoon and give that a good stir to incorporate it. And this is just a homemade vanilla extract. I have a video where I show you how to do this, but I also share a total of 10 homemade extracts, which are kind of fun to make. So if that's something that interests you, be sure to check the description underneath where I'll share that a link to that video. Okay, I think that's well incorporated. Now I'm going to make a well in here, right in the middle of my flour and oat mixture. And the reason I do that, whenever you're adding wet ingredients to dry ingredients, it's always great to make a little well like this so that the wet ingredients aren't just sort of like sitting right on top. They become a little easier to incorporate. And you want your liquid to be easier to incorporate with your flour mixture whenever you're making quick breads, because over mixing is the enemy of a tender quick bread. You always want to mix just enough until all the flour is moistened and there are no streaks of flour remaining, and then you want to stop. You don't want to overmix, otherwise your quick bread, and this also applies to muffins, will be tough. And although technically this is referred to as a cake, it's really, especially if you make it in a loaf pan, it's very much the consistency of a quick bread. Well, let's go ahead and pour this in without too much splattering. Now I'm just going to mix this mixture with the flour until I get everything nicely incorporated, but not overmixed. Well, I've got my batter all mixed up, and now what I'm going to do is go ahead and pour this as neatly as I can. I'll come back and use my spatula in a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and pour the batter into my greased and floured tube pan. Well, I've got my tube pan all filled with the cake batter, and this worked out perfectly, because generally when you're working with a tube pan or a bundt pan, anything like that, it's best to fill it maybe just 2/3 of the way. You don't necessarily want to fill it right to the rim. 2/3 of the way or 3/4 of the way is generally a perfect amount of batter for a pan like this. Alrighty, now let's go put this in our 325 Fahrenheit oven. The original instruction says to bake this for 1 hour. Whenever I'm baking anything, I always like to check it a little ahead of time of the recipe's recommended time, because everybody's oven is different. And so I'm going to check this at 50 minutes. And I'll put some toothpicks on the part of the cake. You know, there's no center of the cake, just to check and see if they come out clean, and if it does, it's done. If not, I'll continue to let it bake for the full hour. Alrighty, well, let's go ahead and put this in the oven. Well, I just took this cake out of the oven, and it did take the full hour to bake, and it smells glorious. Now, I just want to give it a few minutes to cool so that it's a little easier for me to handle. Then we'll take it out of the pan, and I'm going to let it cool a little more on the cooling rack, and then we'll slice it and give it a taste. While this is cooling, I just wanted to show you this printout, the printout that I showed you in the very beginning with the sugarless Sundae war cake. This was specifically made for that PBS special that I talked about, but they took that and the other recipes from this government printout. It must have been some type of book or pamphlet, and it was put out by the United States Food Administration, and it was called War Economy in Food with Suggestions and Recipes, Substitutions in the Planning of Meals. And I will link to this in my blog post that'll correspond with this video. So if you want to take a look at this, if these type of recipes interest you, I think you're going to really enjoy this. And, you know, I wanted to mention about home cooks using a lot of molasses. And as I shared with you, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, used a lot of molasses in her cooking because when she could get sugar, either when she had enough ration points for it and it was available, or she could afford it during the Depression, she used her sugar very carefully and primarily reserved it for her home canning, as many home cooks of that day did. And it was interesting, even the government wanted to make sure that home cooks did have some sugar available to them for that specific reason, for home canning, because people would make jams and jellies to enjoy with the peanut butter. That was very common, as I shared with you in the previous video, where we made peanut butter bread together. And they also would home can various things and make them tasty, like pickles and sweet and sour beets and onions, you know, dilly beans that had a little sweet flavor to them. So there were a lot of different ways that home cooks needed a little bit of white sugar when they were doing their home canning. But my grandmother specifically had a big apple tree. And so she had a lot of apples. And my mother was sharing with me that she regularly made during harvest season apple jelly. Now, she did a lot of other things with the apples. My mother said she would slice them and bake them in the oven with a little molasses and maybe a little bit of butter if she had it. But at various other, she made applesauce and, you know, various other things. But she would make apple jelly. Then she would have the apple scraps, and she would barter with another lady in the area. They lived in what today is sometimes referred to as rural residential. It's suburban, but there's usually no sidewalks, no street lights, and there may be some homes on lots, and then maybe there's a farm, and then more homes on lots. You know, it's a sort of mixed use type community. And so my grandmother would barter her apple jelly for some eggs from a lady who had chickens. And she would also give the lady some of the apple scraps because the chickens, from making the apple jelly, because the chickens enjoyed the apple scraps. And then this is something that I find so interesting, and you'll have to tell me if you know anything, if you're a really good gardener and you know anything about this or you've heard about this before. I learned about, I've never really done this. I think I've tried it maybe once or twice. But I remember learning about it maybe about 30 years ago, and it is rather fascinating. But with the rest of the apple scraps, my grandmother would give them to my grandfather. And it was all mush, you know, at this point. And he would actually work it into the soil in the garden. My grandmother had a very big garden. And he would just work it right in. There was no bin, there was no making compost or anything like that, just working it right into the soil. And about 30 years ago, I came across this and I learned that this is a technique called cold composting. And apparently it was pretty common for people to do back then, and even now people will do it. And I have to tell you, I have a very old Vitamix that is probably, gosh, 1990, 1991, maybe. I bought it. It's like a reconditioned commercial one that I got at one of those home kitchen sales that they used to have. But it came with two containers, and they're metal. And one has a little spigot, and you can put things in there and then make it like a soft serve ice cream if you have bananas or whatever the case may be. And the other is just plain. It's just a plain metal container. And in the book that came with my Vitamix, it talked about whirling up your scraps, your various fruit and vegetable scraps, in this Vitamix and then pouring them right into your garden and then just working them into the soil. And it wasn't, and I thought, well, that's interesting. And I may have tried it once or twice, but I do have a composter, and so I kind of fell away from it. But it wasn't until my mom and I were talking about my grandmother making apple jelly that the scraps came up, and my mother was talking about my grandfather working them into the soil. And I thought, oh my gosh, they were doing this, this is the Depression, and World War II. But in any event, what I wanted to tell you about the apple jelly and being very frugal with the white sugar, the people in the community where my mother lived and my grandmother and grandfather loved my grandmother's apple jelly. And my mom said it had a real nice tang to it. That should give you a little hint. She said it had a real nice tang to it, and so it was wonderful because it kind of offset the more heavy flavor of the peanut butter when they would have peanut butter and apple jelly sandwiches. Well, everybody in the neighborhood would say the same thing. They'd say, oh, it's got a nice little tang and you really taste the apples. Well, it was because my grandmother was only using about half the amount of sugar that would normally have been used to make an apple jelly. So I thought that was cute, but she was very frugal and she was being very careful with her sugar. And I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of home cooks did that. And again, so much of what they did during these various eras when things were either in short supply or rationed or expensive actually turned out to be healthier for them. And that's something I love, just being a traditional foods cook, is that we can make our foods healthier at the same time maybe being a little more frugal, maybe creating more of a no-waste kitchen, just all good things. I often joke that my mother and my grandparents on both sides of my family and all the people of the eras going through world wars and going through the Great Depression, they were all green long before we even had the term green. One other thing I want to share with you, and those of you who enjoy cookbooks and food writing will know this author right away. But this is a very famous book. It's called How to Cook a Wolf. But don't worry, you're not cooking a wolf, but How to Cook a Wolf. And it's by M.F.K. Fisher. And she's a wonderful food writer. And she's writing during World War II. She has a recipe in here for war cake, and she reminisces about eating war cake during World War I as a child. And her recipe is a little different. It's a little more modernized, as I said. There's still the bacon grease, or some sort of lard or fat in the recipe, but there is some white flour and white sugar when home cooks could get it. This is such an interesting book to read about how to obviously make the best out of whatever ingredients were available to you for making meals during the times of rationing and shortages during World War II, but how to make them tasty and enjoyable, and just to make the best of things, no matter what the situation. So I highly recommend this book. It's a very reasonable paperback. Alrighty, this has cooled a little, so it's going to make it a little easier for me to flip this over onto the cooling rack. And I have to tell you a funny story. When I was a little girl and my mother was teaching me how to bake, and we were using that tube pan that I showed you earlier, and she gave it to me to grease and to flour, and I forgot to grease and flour the middle part, the tube, and so it stuck a little. But after that, I always remembered, okay, I've got to always remember to grease the tube. It's easy to forget, but even with greasing, I hope that this comes out easily. I don't want to go in with a knife to try to loosen it if I don't have to, but we shall see. Alrighty, now this, I've got to tell you, I'm going to see how I'm going to do this. You can really tell. This is, I see how they may recommend that you would wait a couple of days to eat this. I think this is going to be a super tasty but super dense cake. It's so heavy. Alrighty, let me see how I can do this. Ah! Oh, it came out nice, I can tell. Let me get this off here. There we go. Look at that beauty. Oh, what a lovely cake. I think this is going to be exceptionally tasty. Look at that. Now I'm going to flip this again. Ah! So I have that top showing. The top is beautiful. I'll include a close-up picture so you can see exactly what that looks like and what it bakes up to. It's very pretty. Now, something that I will tell you, and we'll probably do a little bit of this, is we never had icing in our house. The only time my mother made icing, and it was with a little white powdered sugar and a little lemon juice, and she would just drizzle it on top of Italian Christmas cookies. They're called taralli. She says it much better than me, taralli. And she would just drizzle it on top and then put the little colored sprinkles on top. But that was it. And every other cake my mother made a lot of cakes like this, a lot of tube cakes, and they were just sprinkled lightly with powdered sugar, and that was it. She called it a day. She didn't really think icing was very healthy for you. Remember, again, I told you she very much enjoyed the Adele Davis books and that way of thinking, very much you are what you eat. And so we never had icing, and I'll tell you, this is such a guilty pleasure of mine, but I love icing on cake. And I have to really control myself if we go out and have a treat and have a piece of cake. But I do give myself permission on my birthday to eat all the icing on, not on the whole cake, but on my slice of cake. But in any event, the most that would have been done with this during at either war when it was made, World War I and World War II, and also during the Depression, and even pretty much up today, is a sprinkling of powdered sugar. But it looks so pretty, even as is. Well, this definitely is calling for some powdered sugar. And you know what's so neat about this? The fact that the original recipe had said, oh, let it sit for a couple of days before you slice it or serve it. This is a wonderful make-ahead type cake. And if you have somebody over for coffee, you could serve this in the morning, you could serve this as an afternoon treat. Really, any time would work. I think this is really going to turn out nicely. Well, let's do a little sprinkling of powdered sugar. This always reminds me of my mom. Everything had got a sprinkling, every cake got a sprinkling of powdered sugar. And my husband and I were laughing when I told you earlier about the icing. And I think it's why I like it so much today, because I never had it as a kid. Oh, that looks wonderful. Oh, look at how nice that looks. You slice that up, you serve a cup of coffee. I think anybody would be thrilled to have this. Well, let's go ahead and give this a slice. It's got a nice crisp exterior, which I think is lovely. Oh, you can feel this is a rich cake. Oh, I'm sure that, you know, when times were tough, this was a delight to have something so rich like this. I think that's what the raisins really help with. And speaking of the raisins, I want to mention, not in this recipe, but I think in the Fisher book, she talks about how you can add in, oh, interesting, with the oats, I like it. You can use different types of fruit, dried fruit. You can cut up some dates, you can cut up some figs, whatever the case you have. Wow, this looks really rich. We'll have to see how it tastes, and I'll overlay some close-up pictures. But what fascinates me is it almost looks, it's well baked, but it almost has a little bit of a fudgy appearance. You let me know in the comments what you think too. Well, let's give this a taste. I realize now, upon closer inspection, what is giving it that little bit of fudgy appearance is not the cake, it's the raisins. They're beautifully plumped, different than when you just put them in to a cake or whatever the case may be, or muffins or cookies, because we boiled them. they're very moist inside this cake. I think this is going to be wonderful. But the cake itself, for rye flour, and I'm glad I added some of the oats because I like how it gives it a little bit of a, sort of brightens up the interior picture, so to speak, of the actual cake. And oats are always great. I love to add them to anything I can. Well, let's give this a taste. Oh, it's interesting when you break it up, it definitely feels light. It doesn't feel dense. Well, let's give this a taste now. Get a little bit of everything on here. This is surprisingly delicious. I can really understand why people are still making this today. You've got to try this. Now, if you'd like more recipes from the World War I, World War II, and Depression era, be sure to click on this video over here. We'll have a whole playlist that I know you'll enjoy. And I look forward to seeing you there over in my Texas Hill Country kitchen. Love and God bless.